The Falklands campaign of 1982 saw the largest deployment of British Special Forces since the Second World War. The Special Air Service, the Special Boat Squadron and the Royal Marines Mountain and Arctic Warfare Cadre conducted spectacular raids during the war. One of the most successful was the attack made by D Squadron SAS against an Argentine airfield on Pebble Island. Eleven Argentine aircraft that had posed a serious threat to the British amphibious landings on the Falkland Islands were destroyed. It was a fine example of the SAS motto, "Who dares wins." Deep in the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands had been a source of dispute between Britain and Argentina ever since the British first settled there in 1833. Known as Las Malvinas by the Argentines, the barren, windswept islands are just 300 miles from mainland Argentina and 8,000 from Britain. But at the beginning of the 1980s, their population of 1,800 was staunchly British and strongly opposed to any links with Argentina. In 1982, the military junta, which had ruled Argentina for 7 years, was growing increasingly unpopular. In a dirty war against left-wing groups, more than 3,000 Argentine citizens had disappeared without trace. The economy was in ruins, with inflation rocketing to more than 600%. Mass union demonstrations filled the streets with violence and tear gas. The military dictatorship was desperate for a foreign diversion. They found one on the 19th of March 1982, when Argentine scrap dealers began work dismantling old buildings on the British dependency of South Georgia, 900 miles southeast of the Falkland Islands. Accompanying them were some Argentine soldiers, who illegally raised the Argentine flag over British territory. The British demanded that it be lowered and the troops withdrawn. When this was ignored, the Royal Navy survey ship HMS Endurance was sent from the Falkland Islands to South Georgia to remove the Argentine military presence. Argentina's rulers took this as an act of war. On the 2nd of April, over 700 Argentine Marines landed on the Falkland Islands and overwhelmed the small garrison of 67 British Royal Marines protecting the islands. The British were captured by the Argentine Special Forces unit, Buzo Táctico, and forced to surrender. The next day, Argentine forces captured the island of South Georgia against fierce resistance from the garrison of only 22 Royal Marines stationed there. The Argentine people were rapturous as their military occupied the Malvinas. In a remarkable turnaround of public feeling, the much-hated military junta suddenly became popular. In London, the government of Margaret Thatcher reacted swiftly.
British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete.
In the space of one weekend, 100 ships and thousands of troops were made ready for war. On Monday, the 5th of April, the task force set sail on its 8,000-mile voyage to the Falkland Islands. With it went the headquarters of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, Britain's elite Special Forces unit, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Michael Rose. Only 2 months earlier, the SAS had started contingency planning for operations in the Falklands, but had been told that no scenario could be envisaged where it would be necessary to deploy them to the islands. The troops honed their skills as the task force headed south. At first, a holiday atmosphere prevailed, as few believed a war was inevitable. But diplomatic talks at the United Nations were getting nowhere. On the 5th of April, D Squadron of the SAS flew ahead to the US base on Ascension Island, near the equator. From there, they embarked on the supply ship Fort Austin as part of an advance force to South Georgia. With them were members of Britain's most secretive Special Forces unit, the Special Boat Squadron. The SBS was primarily responsible for beach reconnaissance prior to an amphibious landing. Meanwhile, Royal Navy nuclear attack submarines were already patrolling the South Atlantic. And on the 7th of April, Britain declared a 200-mile total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands. Any aircraft or ship that entered the zone was liable to be destroyed. 2 weeks later, the advance force reached South Georgia. Mountain Troop of D Squadron SAS was embarked on helicopters for an assault. Under the command of Captain Gavin Hamilton, they were landed on the inhospitable Fortuna Glacier, some distance from the Argentine garrisons at Grytviken and Leith. Unexpectedly, the weather conditions worsened, with blizzards making progress impossible. Hamilton requested evacuation, but 2 helicopters crashed on the glacier in the whiteout conditions. Eventually, the men of Mountain Troop were extracted during a fierce blizzard by a Wessex helicopter nicknamed Humphrey, skillfully flown by Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley. 19 men were crammed into a helicopter designed to carry just 5. For his brilliant flying, Stanley was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Undeterred, the commander of the SAS detachment, Major Cedric Delves, decided to put his boat troop ashore in their 5 Gemini inflatable craft. But the Gemini's outboard engines could not cope with the rough seas. 2 Gemini were swept away by high winds. 1 crew managed to make its way ashore and go into hiding. The other was saved by Humphrey and Ian Stanley. Meanwhile, No. 2 Section Special Boat Squadron was also inserted onto South Georgia by helicopter, where it kept the enemy under surveillance. Soon, the Argentine submarine Santa Fe was detected in the area. The Royal Navy flotilla dispersed until the threat was neutralized. Helicopters armed with depth charges and missiles took to the air and caught the Santa Fe on the surface. The submarine limped into harbour and sank. With the threat eliminated, the Royal Navy ships returned. Major Guy Sheridan, commander of M Company Royal Marines, and his SAS counterpart Major Delves decided to mount another helicopter assault, supported by the naval gunfire of the frigates HMS Antrim, Brilliant and Plymouth. Once ashore, the Royal Marines and the SAS quickly advanced on Grytviken and accepted the Argentine surrender on the 25th of April. It was a small but significant victory, and the government was quick to capitalize upon it.
The commander of the operation has sent the following message. Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen.
What happens next, Mr. Nunn?
Thank you very much.
Just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
The reaction in Argentina was equally belligerent. Meanwhile, G Squadron SAS was flown from Britain to Ascension Island. Its task was covert reconnaissance, while D Squadron was to undertake any offensive raids. From Ascension Island, the squadron joined the task force. And its men were able to start training with the helicopter squadron, which was to support the Special Forces units. As the task force neared the Falklands, G Squadron transferred to the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes. From there, Sea King helicopters inserted 8 SAS and 2 SBS reconnaissance teams onto both the main Falkland Islands. They landed over a 3-day period and began transmitting information about the Argentine defences. Just 1 month after the Argentine invasion, the campaign to retake the Falklands was about to begin. In the last 2 weeks of April, the British task force encountered steadily worsening weather conditions as it got closer to the Falkland Islands. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, conducted an exhausting round of shuttle diplomacy between London and Buenos Aires in an attempt to prevent open conflict. But neither the Argentine people nor the military dictatorship would give in. In Buenos Aires, massive patriotic parades were held to celebrate the union of the Malvinas with the motherland. And in London, Haig found that compromise was not a word in Margaret Thatcher's vocabulary. As the British prepared for war, the United States was forced to make a choice between its closest ally in Europe and a major South American partner.
It's a very difficult situation for the United States because we're friends with both of the countries engaged in this dispute. And we stand ready to do anything we can to help them, and what we hope for and would like to help in doing is have a peaceful resolution of this with no forceful action or no bloodshed.
The Americans chose to back the British, providing vital satellite intelligence and some of the latest military hardware, including AIM-9L Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. The remarkable combination of the Sidewinder and the Sea Harrier was fundamental to British air superiority over the Falkland Islands, and with it, the ability to win the war. The American elite Special Forces unit, Delta Force, provided its SAS counterpart with state-of-the-art communications equipment and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles not yet used in action. Meanwhile, the Argentines were heavily reinforcing their military presence on the islands. But their armed forces had not fought a war for over 100 years, and many of their troops were raw conscripts with only weeks of training. In comparison, soldiers of the British Army had fought and died every single year for the last 100 years except one. As full-time professionals, they displayed an unmatched level of training and commitment. But fighting 8,000 miles from home would put them at a grave disadvantage. By the beginning of May, the Argentines had 11,000 troops on the islands, plus 42 aircraft and helicopters. They were well equipped with powerful artillery and mortar weapons, numerous anti-aircraft guns and missiles, as well as modern communications and electronic warfare equipment. The SAS and SBS parties on the islands set up their observation posts, or OPs, from which they could survey the numbers and disposition of the Argentine troops. For up to a month, the watchers remained silent and immobile in their OPs, overlooking the Argentine positions, usually in awful weather with little food and no heat. The information these teams transmitted back to the task force was crucial in determining where the amphibious landings would take place. Meanwhile, the first Royal Navy and Royal Air Force airstrikes against the airport at Stanley were already underway. Tensions were heightened on the 2nd of May when the nuclear hunter-killer submarine HMS Conqueror detected the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano and her escorts just outside the British-imposed 200-mile total exclusion zone.
355-ish.
Though the Argentines were just shy of violating the zone, the British War Cabinet decided their weapons were a potential threat to the task force. The General Belgrano was attacked with torpedoes and sunk. 321 men lost their lives. The war had begun in earnest. With the carriers of the task force now only 250 miles northeast of the Falklands, the Argentines soon exacted their revenge. On the 4th of May, a pair of French-built Super Étendard fighter bombers took off from mainland Argentina. They were armed with the French Aerospatiale Exocet sea-skimming missile. Flying below radar detection height, the aircraft approached the task force at high speed. At a distance of 30 miles, they appeared and engaged their targets. As soon as a target was identified, the Exocet missiles were fired. Flying at just 20 feet above the sea and at 680 miles an hour, one Exocet locked onto the destroyer HMS Sheffield. "20 men died, and the shiny Chef became a burning, useless hulk. It was a great shock to the task force. If one of the aircraft carriers, HMS Invincible or HMS Hermes, was sunk or disabled, an amphibious landing would be impossible, and the war lost. The air-launched Exocet was too great a threat to be ignored. The British government turned to the SAS for an answer. They called on Brigadier Peter de la Billière, Director of Special Forces. A desperate plan was hatched, codenamed Operation Mikado. It called for B Squadron SAS to fly from Ascension Island in 2 C-130 transport planes and land at the Rio Grande Air Base, where the Super Étendard were believed to be stationed. Once there, they were to destroy the aircraft and eliminate their pilots. The plan was met with incredulity by B Squadron, and when the squadron commander, Major John Moss, protested its shortcomings, he was promptly replaced. Many members of B Squadron began writing their wills, as they believed Operation Mikado was a suicide mission. But nearly all agreed to go. Under a new commander, B Squadron was flown to Ascension Island for intensive training to prepare for the assault. Fortunately, wiser counsel prevailed. The British government realized the political and military implications of a catastrophic SAS raid on the Argentine mainland. And Operation Mikado was cancelled. But the British did have some Special Forces teams already operating covertly on the Argentine mainland. The Argentines soon became aware of this when on the 20th of May the wreckage of a burning Royal Navy Sea King helicopter was found in neutral Chile. It was promptly buried by the Chilean authorities, but its crew appeared at a press conference.
Whilst on sea patrol, we experienced an engine failure. Due to adverse weather, it was not possible to return to our ship in this condition. We therefore sought refuge in the nearest neutral country.
Their explanation was officially accepted, but all indications were that the team had been engaged in a covert operation. The crewman on the left was one of the most experienced Special Forces helicopter pilots in the British task force. and a helicopter crashed at a spot equidistant from the 3 main Argentine air bases from which attacks were launched against the British. Even a Royal Navy intelligence gathering vessel was hiding among the many inlets and islands of Chilean neutral waters nearby, though it remained undiscovered. The Exocet was still a major problem for the British. Finally, Margaret Thatcher persuaded President Mitterrand of France not to supply the Argentines with any more Exocet missiles, despite the terms of the original contract. It was a sacrifice for the French. The going price for an air-launched Exocet had been $450,000, but the Argentines were willing to pay $1 million. The British Secret Service was given $50 million to purchase every Exocet on the international arms market. Those that could not be bought were sabotaged. But the Argentines were not about to give up. By early May 1982, the British task force had gained air supremacy over the Falkland Islands. But with winter fast approaching, the decision as to where and when to make the amphibious landings had to be made quickly. With its particular expertise in amphibious warfare, the Special Boat Squadron was reconnoitring numerous beaches and possible landing sites. This is a view of one of the landing sites that was finally selected at Port San Carlos. Working mainly at night, SBS teams approached by boat or underwater. They use specialized equipment, like beach profile recorders, to determine whether a particular beach was suitable for landing craft and support vehicles. Although armed, the SBS preferred to operate by their motto, not by strength, by guile. With the help of the SBS's intelligence, the decision was made for the amphibious landings to be on the western edge of East Falkland at San Carlos Water. But G Squadron SAS had already identified a serious potential threat to the proposed landing site. At Pebble Island on West Falkland, there was an airstrip where the Argentines had based 6 Pucara ground attack aircraft. Armed with rockets and napalm canisters, these could cause untold casualties among the closely packed troops on the landing beaches. First, the SAS had to eliminate this threat in an all-out raid. On the night of the 11th of May, a reconnaissance team made a covert insertion by canoe. After hiding their craft, the reconnaissance team observed the Pebble Island airstrip for several days. The commander of D Squadron SAS, Major Cedric Delves, takes up the story.
It's a question then of moving forward, what would you call the close reconnaissance. Only 2 men went forward. The intention was to confirm we had a target. One had to get fairly close. At this stage, we wanted detailed information. After all, we're bringing in a squadron to attack. The patrol was able to look onto the airstrip and see, in fact, there were 11 aircraft up there, which were very well dispersed around the airstrip. As soon as possible after dark, they did move back and put together a message to be transmitted back to the squadron on Hermes. The squadron inserted an additional 40 men towards the islands through a very dark and stormy night. It would be wrong to say that tension was rising in any particularly dramatic way, but we were anxious to get off the helicopters as soon as we were on land. Sooner really we would become masters of our own destiny. We had chosen the drop-off point some way back from the target. In fact, it was about 5 miles, to be quite certain that the enemy would not hear our approach. But nevertheless, we wanted to get those helicopters very quickly. quickly, so deplane as quickly as possible, and the helicopter lifted off. The commanders came forward to the patrol and received the updated plan.
Okay, if you can close in now, because this position is defended. Okay, it's going to have to be a very quick briefing because we're about an hour late now.
Personally, I've been clock watching ever since I left Hermes, and I knew I was beginning to run out of time. The whole process couldn't have taken more than a quarter of an hour from drop-off to confirm brief to move off, but it seemed like an age.
Right position here, and then we'll split up.
All in all, people were carrying a lot of equipment that night. I would say the average load would have been a Bergen of about 40 or 50 pounds, and belt equipment, say 20 or 30 pounds. So we reached the final RV, the launch point, at 7:30, which was also not only a final checkpoint for the return of the troops, but also was going to be the mortar position. Troops, as they reached the point, dropped off the mortar bombs they were carrying, with the mortar team who established themselves. And I thought, well, since we're here, we might as well let the troops go forward and do what damage they could for 15 minutes. As it turned out, actually, I had great difficulty in getting them back, and didn't get them back for 45 minutes.
The attack on the airstrip itself was conducted on the night of the 14th of May by Mountain Troop under the command of Captain Gavin Hamilton. The raid was a complete success, and all 6 Bukharas, as well as 5 other aircraft on the airstrip, were destroyed. The SAS suffered only 2 minor casualties, and all the raiders returned safely to the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes. The British landings could go ahead with a much reduced threat of air attack. But for the SAS, tragedy lay ahead. The success of the SAS raid on Pebble Island meant that by the 15th of May, the British task force could make its final preparations for landing on the Falkland Islands. But on the 19th of May, during a simple administrative flight, a Sea King helicopter carrying troops of D and G squadrons of the SAS was struck by a large bird. The helicopter plunged into the sea, and 20 members of the regiment perished. It was the greatest loss of life suffered by the SAS since the Second World War. Despite this tragedy, the British landed in San Carlos water on the morning of the 21st of May. Within hours, the British were safely ashore without any opposition. But then, the Argentine Air Force struck back with great courage and determination. It was the critical phase of the war. Several British warships were sunk. On the Argentine National Day of the 25th of May, the Exocet claimed its most important victim so far, the massive container ship Atlantic Conveyor. Not only did she contain thousands of tons of irreplaceable military stores, but the Atlantic conveyor also carried vital helicopters that were needed to airlift the troops across East Falkland for the advance on the capital, Stanley. The British troops now had to march over 50 miles across the width of the island with all their equipment. With the weather deteriorating rapidly with the onset of winter, it was a daunting task for even the fittest of soldiers. But first, paratroopers had to eliminate the Argentine garrison at Goose Green. As they advanced, they were attacked by Pucaras. Suddenly, an SAS trooper rose up from his hidden position in the gorse and fired a Stinger missile. One Pucara crashed in flames. The others fled and did not return to assist their comrades in the battle which followed. On the 28th of May, the 600 men of the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment won a great victory at Goose Green when the Argentine garrison of 1,200 surrendered after 14 hours of heavy fighting. Meanwhile, an SAS patrol had discovered that Mount Kent, a vital hill position just 10 miles west of Stanley, was only lightly defended by the Argentines. Lieutenant Colonel Rose immediately inserted the whole of D Squadron to hold the position. For days, the SAS fought off repeated attacks until reinforcements arrived. The Royal Marines crossing the northern flank of West Falkland to Port Stanley were led by their own Special Forces unit, the Mountain and Arctic Warfare Cadre. These Marines were trained to fight and survive in the most difficult weather and terrain conditions anywhere in the world. On the 31st of May, one of the cadre's 4-man patrols spotted an Argentine position held by 17 of their elite Special Forces commandos at a desolate and isolated farmhouse called Top Marlow. The Royal Marines alerted their commander, Captain Rod Boswell, who decided to mount a raid with all the men he had available. The 19 Marines were split into 2 teams, with a fire group on one hillock overlooking Top Marlow House. Its task was to give supporting fire as the 12-man assault group charged the buildings from an adjacent hillock. The Marines were not greatly impressed by their opponent's combat readiness.
Their professionalism left a little bit to be desired, and they shouldn't have been in an isolated farmhouse, most certainly not inside it anyway, and if they were, they should have had sentries well clear of the building to cover the approaches. And we gave a few indications of our presence. We'd stampeded some sheep by accident, obviously. We'd come across some sheep, we'd come in a helicopter, and a real professional bunch would have made up for that. But they made up for their lack of professionalism by their courage. I mean, they certainly did not lack courage.
The battle was to begin with the fire group hitting the house with anti-tank rockets. Boswell had intended the assault group to advance in 2 mutually supporting sections, but things didn't work out as he had planned.
And I will always remember the charge. I mean, my memories of running in and thinking they've all disobeyed me to a man, fantastic.
All his men had leapt to their feet and charged with fixed bayonets. The Argentines were caught completely unawares.
These men hadn't. The first warning they had of our presence was a building exploding all around them. They all got out of the house, those that could, and every man that got out of that house fought. They all got out with their weapons, and they fought with their weapons until they couldn't fight any longer.
The Argentine survivors of the initial bombardment rushed out of the building and ran to a stream where they took up positions along its bank. The ammunition inside Top Marlow House exploded and the building caught fire. The smoke masked the advance of the Marines as they charged towards the Argentines. They fired their grenade launchers over the building to drop onto the Argentine commandos sheltering along the stream bank. 2 of the assault group were severely injured by gunshot wounds in the intense firefight. While this was going on, the fire group moved forward under cover of the burning building. The fire group then emerged from behind the burning building and attacked the Argentines from the flank. A grenade killed the Argentine commander and the remainder surrendered. 5 Argentines were dead and 12 were captured. 7 of those were injured. Only 3 British were wounded. In the 28-minute battle, the Argentine Special Forces troops had been decisively beaten. After tending the wounded, there was one final task: to check out the battlefield.
The building by that time had completely fallen down. There was one other little task. There was one, we'd checked the peak building. We'd obviously fairly successfully taken out the house and the sheep building. And there was one other building, the outhouse, that had to be cleared. And the nearest man to it was called McGregor, so I shouted down to McGregor, clear the outhouse.
And Captain Boswell shouted to me to clear that toilet. And I think what he expected me to do was to go over and knock at the door and say, "Excuse me, would you like to come out and join us? We've had a little fight here." But as it was, I turned around and I thought, there's no way I'm going over there, just in case one of them happened to be in there. So I let off the whole magazine in the toilet. And the methane that was in the little bucket in these outside toilets exploded and blew the toilet completely up. And all the guys who were around here thought, well, that's just a lovely culmination to the whole thing. We all cheered as this toilet disappeared in a big blue flame. They all thought, well, that's a culmination of the whole thing. And that was the end of Top Mallow, really, when the toilet disappeared.
It was now the turn of the Argentine troops in the hills overlooking Stanley to feel the full brunt of the British offensive. As the British forces prepared for the final battle to recapture the Falklands, the guns of the Royal Artillery pounded the Argentine positions around the island's capital, Stanley. From the end of May until the 10th of June, when the main battle for Stanley began, SAS teams were active on both East and West Falkland. 4-man patrols continued their reconnaissance mission. On the 5th of June, one of these patrols was deployed to Fox Bay on West Falkland to man an observation post. On the 10th of June, this was discovered by an Argentine patrol. Although heavily outnumbered, the patrol commander, Captain Gavin Hamilton, engaged the enemy in a fierce firefight to allow his men time to retire to safety. Despite severe wounds, he fought on until he was killed. Hamilton was awarded a posthumous military cross. Knowing that the islanders normally communicated with each other by shortwave radio, the SAS used the same frequency to conduct a psychological warfare campaign against the Argentine High Command. At this stage of the war, only the doctor, Alison Bleaney, was allowed to use the radio in order to treat her patients. On the 8th of June, the SAS made their first contact with the Argentines through her. From then on, the SAS applied increasing pressure on the Argentines to accept honourable surrender, rather than a final, futile battle for Stanley with inevitable civilian casualties. On the night of the 13th of June, as the battles for the hills overlooking Stanley raged, the SAS and SBS mounted one last diversionary raid in conjunction with the Royal Marines' 1st Raiding Squadron. After a clandestine briefing, the rigid raider assault boat set off across Howden Water to attack an Argentine logistics base near Stanley. The raiders consisted of 3 SAS troops and 6 men from the SBS in 4 rigid raiders. As their assault boats hit the shoreline, they were illuminated by searchlights from an Argentine hospital ship. This was in total contravention of the Geneva Conventions, which forbid a medical unit to play any part in active combat. Every gun in the area opened up on the raiders. They made a hasty retreat, but now pointed their craft towards the hospital ship. Rounds flew everywhere, striking the hospital ship and the rigid raiders alike. Once behind the hospital ship, the torrent of fire slackened, but one of the boats had been hit in its outboard engine and had barely made it to safety. All 4 rigid raiders were completely burnt out, but miraculously, only 3 men were injured. Meanwhile, in the hills overlooking Stanley, the SAS was using laser target designators to direct Harriers carrying laser-guided bombs.
Roger, a bit plus of where we were aiming. The bomb's gone. There's the bomb. Got it? Okay. Switch on. Yes, got it. Just a little bit over from where I was aiming. An absolute beauty, I would say. Probably where they're in the defensive position.
What was it, 1,000 pounder?
Yeah.
I have my number 2 with other weapons if you'd like them to deliver on a...
Spot on here.
They also directed devastating artillery fire against Argentine troops in the hills. The fire was so effective that on the morning of June the 14th, the majority of the Argentines fled their positions. The SAS observers stopped fire, allowing the survivors to retreat unmolested. The Argentines were now in full retreat. At 1100 hours on the 14th of June, the Argentine High Command contacted the SAS to discuss ceasefire terms. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Rose boarded a Gazelle helicopter and flew to Stanley. With him were an SAS signaller and a Royal Marine officer who spoke fluent Spanish, Captain Rod Bell. After hours of negotiations, they persuaded General Mario Menendez that surrender was the only sensible course.
There is a white flag flying over Stanley. Very marvellous.
The Land Force commander, Major General Jeremy Moore, accepted the Argentine surrender at midnight that same day. A signal was sent to London via the SAS satellite communications link. The Falkland Islands are once more under the government desired by their inhabitants. God save the Queen. More than 700 Argentines and 253 British troops had died in the process. The Falklands War could not have been won without the Special Forces. Their skills ensured a safe landing for the main British force after its 8,000-mile journey. And during the land campaign which followed, they helped to maintain the pressure, which brought the whole campaign to a triumphant conclusion only 72 days after the Argentines had first raised their flag over the islands.